I like to address the younger generations tonight, and I like to make 3 points. The first point that I would like to make is about solidarity. And the second point is about responsibility. And the third point about human rights. Speaking of solidarity, I would like to thank the young people for the way in which they, in general, not always, not everybody, not everywhere, but in general, made a huge effort to keep the elderly safe during the COVID crisis. The t-shirt I'm wearing is all about solidarity. It expresses how the young and the old can mutually respect each other's interests. We want to keep you safe, and we thank you for keeping us safe during COVID. Despite the overwhelming use of digital tools and media, I could imagine that some of you have felt isolated or even depressed. But luckily, young people are resilient, and I'm sure that you will recover from the COVID period. In turn, you may ask from us, the elderly, that we do not only look at our own best interest, but also take your future into account. And climate change has huge implications, already at present, but more so in future. And I personally will not witness the consequences of a lifestyle that I and you have grown accustomed to. It is not sustainable to keep up a comfortable lifestyle that uses up 3 times the resources that the Earth can provide. And we have to reduce our ecological footprint. And we have to learn to restrain our consumption. Not only solidarity between generations is required, but also solidarity between the haves and the have-nots, both within wealthy countries like the Netherlands, as well as between the rich countries and the low-income countries. And the West has a huge historical responsibility for the climate crisis. The second point I'd like to make is about responsibility. Personally, I do not feel guilty about the life that I lived so far, but I do feel responsible. And responding to the court ruling that Shell has made is responsible concerning the CO2 emissions to a large extent. Jeroen van der Veer, the former CEO of Shell, made a remark and said, we are not a signatory to the Treaty of Paris. And we only respond to the demand of our customers. To me, that sounds like the logic of a drugs dealer. The oil, the gas, the coal sector has a specific and enormous responsibility for the climate crisis, and they should acknowledge that. Instead of his defensive response, Van der Veer could also have said, we at Shell accept our specific responsibility, and we call for the sector to come together during COP26 in Glasgow for a side conference to come to an agreement to reduce the extraction of fossil resources and to switch to becoming sustainable energy companies as soon as possible. A point for discussion in being in this legal capital: which legal instruments can be put in place to force the fossil industry to stop drilling and pumping? And my third point is about human rights. The appeal that Grootouders voor het Klimaat, the organization I work for, makes is a moral one. for the sake of our grandchildren, we, the elderly, need to change our behavior. In Dutch we say, de jeugd heeft de toekomst. The future belongs to the youth. But we have to move away from just a moral appeal. We need to establish tools to give a voice to the ones that don't have a voice yet. In Dutch, een stem geven aan degenen die nog geen stem hebben. I propose to introduce a future generations test. Legislation needs to be legally reviewed against the consequences for the people without a voice, to protect their human rights. And this idea of a generatietoets was proposed before by the jonge klimaatbeweging in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, the Raad van State reviews the climate policy of the government against the consequences it has for the realizations of the aims of the Dutch climate law. Zero emissions by 2050 and 55% reduction by 2030. You could imagine that all laws are reviewed against the consequences they have for the future generations. Would this be a role for a climate authority, or for the Raad van State, or for the Hoge Raad? I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. We, grootouders voor het klimaat, we propose that the Constitution to be the basis for the review. And at present, that is not possible. The authority, or the council or the court, whoever is responsible for this in the future, should be advised by experts, and in the Netherlands by the Planbureau voor de Leefomgeving, the PBL. And in other countries where they have it, the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court could take that role of a reviewer. By the way, isn't it strange that in the Netherlands we don't have a climate outbreak management team like the one we have for COVID? A team of scientists appointed to advise the government on the measures to be taken. The lack of a climate OMT can only be explained if the climate crisis is not considered to be a real crisis. Politicians lack a sense of urgency when it comes to the climate disaster, as Sigrid Kaag has put it. And I propose that younger generations demand that a legal future generations test is introduced, both nationally in the Netherlands as well as internationally, possibly during the COP26 conference. A moral appeal is not sufficient anymore. In order to force the generations with political and economic power, the young have to demand for a legal instrument. And you have to fight for your right. Thank you.